right on the hour, so a couple minutes. You guys ready to go?
Every day.
Yeah. This is the day in life, right?
That's right.
Is that your little dealer? Interesting.
Yes, it's got a microphone in here and in the camera.
Nice.
Kind of inconspicuous.
Well, you wouldn't know it's there if you didn't know it was there, really.
Yeah.
And even if that was the case, you wouldn't know that what it is.
Right.
Almost it's like a design.
Right, yeah, like an Alexa type thing.
Which is really what it is. I mean, essentially the camera, right?
Yeah.
Well, I guess we'll just go ahead and get started, guys. We appreciate you coming. Thank you very much. I think I've met everybody in the room, but if I haven't, I'm sorry. But my name is Mark Whitford. I'm with Right Management. I work with Doug Franklin, who you may have met, who is the HRPS president for the Florida chapter. He couldn't be here today, so he apologizes. And then Phyllis Timmons, and she'll be here. She had a dental emergency, but apparently she can't see her dentist till noon, so she's going to come join us as well. But thank you guys for coming. We're going to have a little bit of fun today, so I want to cover just a couple of quick housekeeping things. Your cell phones, we're going to be texting in some answers to some poll questions that we got. Good morning. So feel free to bring your phones out. There is Wi-Fi here, so if you want to use the Wi-Fi, it does work on cellular data, but if you want to, the login is it's the guest network on your phones. The login is Wi-Fi guest is the username, and then the password is teamwork 2019 with an exclamation point. And so what we're going to be doing is kind of an interactive poll where you'll be texting in some answers to some things that we have up on the board. And then we have a great panel here today that I'm going to introduce here to you that's going to be doing some responses to some of the questions we have posed on the screen. But as I think you guys know in prior sessions, this is a very interactive session, so we want, if you have specific questions about some scenarios you're kind of running through, just anything, we're happy to help you guys out. So,
thank you, because I can't see them.
Okay, so
one more time.
It's the guest network. The login is, so your username is Wi-Fi guest, one word. And then the password is, it's capital T, it's teamwork, one word, and that's 2019 exclamation point. You're welcome. And so when I pull up the poll, you'll see there's going to be a text number we'll text you. And then down in the text box, there'll be something I'll have you do as well. And then once you send that, we'll be able to start to respond to the questions. You won't have to log back into that system. It's just going to be quick little answers. And then again, the questions were kind of things that we got from some of you folks. You know, obviously, in our role, or my role with Right, I spend a lot of time dealing with clients. And so these are a lot of the questions that people have on their mind. You know, and so we're going to get some good definitions and some answers to some of those things. And again, if you have other questions that you want to ask, you know, obviously Mike and David are here to help facilitate those. If we don't get through all the questions, I think I have 12 or so. We very well may. If we don't, Mike and David said that they'd be happy to respond to those. And then what we'll do is we'll post that onto the HRPS site. So in there, there's a library of all the prior presentations, and so you can go in there and just kind of tap that in and use it as a resource. So, any questions about any of that at all? It's going to be fun. I hope this technology works. I've tested it, so it should. If you like it, it is a free service. It's a company called Poll Everywhere. It's Poll Everywhere. They do have some, it's just an application you put on your PC. And then once you pull PowerPoint up, it actually populates one of the tabs on the top. And then you just go in there and enter your questions in. There's a lot of different formats you can set up, which is great. It is an application that you can actually purchase to get some added value of different things, but just on the preliminary surface of it, it's a free service. And it's a pretty neat way to kind of create an interactive session. So anyway, we're excited about that. So our panelists today are Mike Malfitano. Mike is a senior labor attorney, and he assists employers in problem prevention and legal analysis of complex employment issues. He has represented employers in litigation and compliance cases involving every aspect of employee relationships. He also represents employers in collective bargaining, arbitration, union avoidance, and he also counsels employers with respect to Title VII and then ADA compliance, employee benefit issues, affirmative action, and then structuring payroll and compensation programs. So very well versed. He practices in Tampa and Lakeland. He's the managing partner at Costanza, Brooks and Smith, labor attorney that's here local and other areas as well. He received his BS from the School of Industrial and Labor Relations from Cornell University and his law degree from Boston College Law School. Mike spends often time, very frequent lecture at seminars for both employers and for other lawyers. And he's also authored a number of labor article books on ADA, FLSA, and FMLA compliance, and a chapter of a book published by the Florida Bar on labor arbitration. He has been recognized as the best lawyers in America, Chambers USA, and Florida Super Lawyer. So welcome, Mike. We appreciate you being here.
Thank you, Mark.
Anything you want to add to that at all? Or?
I was hoping you wouldn't read that whole thing.
Well, I think you put it out here, and I thought, you know what? It really spells out who you are and what you've done, and we very much appreciate you being here. So, we also have David Bell here, who is the CEO of USA Mobile Drug Testing. After seeing firsthand the effects of employee drug use, David Bell worked his way into the industry and up to his current role as CEO of the USA Mobile Drug Testing. And he does that so he can help employers ensure a safer and more productive workplace, which is very important, obviously. We're going to touch on that a little bit in the presentation. Today, he writes extensively on compliance and speaks at industry events to help educate employers. David is also a father of 6 and enjoys fishing with his kids. So welcome, David.
Thanks.
How do you find time to do what you do on the professional side? 6 kids, that's a lot.
It's, there's no such thing as balance, but you work it out.
Well, welcome, guys. We appreciate it. So I'm going to slide back here really quickly. So here's the way this is going to work, guys, and we're going to have some fun with this today. So the first question is just kind of open up and make sure the technology is working. So this is a little different than what the rest of it's going to look like, because the next questions are going to be a specific question, and then there'll be some answers. And those answers you're going to plug into your text area, A, B, C, D, or E, whatever applicable. But on this one, what you need to start out by doing is in your address section, so who you're sending it to, you're going to type in 22333. And then once you have that in who you're sending to, hey fellas, good morning. Down in the other section down below, what your text section would be, you need to type in Mark Whitwer 965. It's all one word, 965, and then just hit send. So once everybody's done that, everybody clear on that? We'll be back over that again. So 22333 is who you're sending to. Down in the actual text section, it's Mark Whitwer 965, and then hit send. And I thought this would be a good place to start, like I said, not only to kind of, make sure the technology is working, but also to spark some conversation and maybe have some interaction. So once you've done those things, just type in one word you would use to describe your feelings about marijuana in the workplace. Ugh. Uneasy, unclear. If anyone's having issues and it's not going through, let me know. If you type in the same word that somebody else does, it just makes the word bigger and bigger. Confused. Uncertain. Obviously one of the reasons that we're here, so. Unsafe. Interesting. Ready. Who typed in ready?
Where'd I go?
It was you, right, Mary? So a lot of confusion around it, right? A lot of thoughts about how this is going to shake out, right? where you're going to be as an employer, and how are you going to hire folks, and how do you manage different things as it relates to this. So, interesting. Scary. I would agree with that one. Especially when you have employees in very high-risk positions, right? It's a big thing. What's going to happen in the workplace. So, is anyone typing in there that's not working for them? Still trying to? So David, as you go around and lecture with folks, I probably haven't done something similar to this as far as a poll is concerned, but do these words kind of resonate with what you're hearing out there?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, the more people learn, the more confused they are about the process. And so they look for someone like me versus a lawyer sometimes is to kind of, what's real world? How do I handle this employee in a real capacity where, let's say you're in construction, you have the highest level of consumption probably in that industry and the highest level of positives. So how do they hire staff and how do they work around someone who's a weekend user but focused during the week?
Right.
You know, and so yeah, it's definitely a challenge.
Any thoughts on that, Mike?
I get a lot of questions and these words pop up. And a lot of people are more confused, I think, than anything else about what's coming in terms of litigation.
Sure.
With medical marijuana.
Okay, interesting. Anyone have any thoughts in there about where they are with this and about the uneasy thoughts and some things that we can help maybe clarify today?
Was anyone else at the Sherman National Conference this summer? So, did you go to the gentleman, so he's an attorney and he's escaping me?
I didn't go to that.
Okay, and so it was amazing to me that it was standing room only. I don't know how many thousands of people were in that particular session. And he is considered a national expert on marijuana in the workplace. And so, I don't know how many thousands of us, he said, if anybody finds it unbelievable that you're in a CHR role, or you're in human resources, and we're talking about marijuana in the workplace, and like, it's almost like I can't believe we're here. And it's just of all the things we've learned and grown over the years we've been in HR, this is just to wrap our heads around what we're doing and what we're talking about is still kind of unbelievable to
Right.
me. And I know we've got to get there, and we have to do policies, and we have to be the answer for our employees as they're asking questions, and our senior leadership is saying, what policies are you putting out there to address this? And we're in the murky middle of unclear and uncertain and worried, and every time we talk to someone, it's stay tuned. I mean, almost every topic is, it's the wild, wild west, and by the way, just in case you think you're updated at 10 o'clock on Wednesday morning, keep paying attention.
That's right. That's right. Well, I think part of this process, or part of this presentation and this meeting, is to think about when it's something that's ready, and are you going to be ready for it? Because it is coming, right? I mean, it's right there. So very interesting. So wonderful. All right. So it sounds like things are working. If someone's having issues, let me know. I'm happy to help out. So we're going to start moving right into the actual questions. So again, the question's going to pop up. You don't have to enter anything else now other than whatever ABC theory, whatever is applicable for you based on that question. Okay? That is if you were able to get in. So first question we're going to talk about now is, do you know who can use medical marijuana under the constitutional amendment and state statute implementing the amendment? And so yes is A, no is B, I think so is C, and I have absolutely no idea would be D.
Are we talking about Florida?
Sure. And I think it could expand out, but I would say if you want to talk about Florida specifically, sure. We've got a question that's going to be specific to how you work in multiple states. But yeah, we can apply that to that. So. Interesting. So 15% say yes, 31% say no. And I'm not surprised that over half of you think, or just kind of I think so, which is interesting. So, but it sounds like everybody at least has it clear that they have no idea. So, Mike, any thoughts about this one?
I'll have a cheat sheet because the constitutional amendment actually listed about 10 different conditions, very specific conditions that enable people to get a medical marijuana card, like cancer, epilepsy, glaucoma, HIV, PTSD, Crohn's disease, Parkinson's. But then there's one big one at the end of the constitutional amendment that said any other debilitating medical condition where a doctor thinks that the patient will benefit more than the harm created by using medical marijuana. And then the legislature came in and enacted an implementing statute and added two more. One was a terminal condition, which makes some sense to me, but the other was chronic malignant pain. And that just blew the doors wide open as to how many people, and how easy it is for people to get a medical marijuana card in Florida, which accounts for the fact that the number of people who have medical marijuana cards has gone from 65,000 in January of 2018 to over 167,000 by the end of 2018, and over 300,000 today. That's a huge number, and it's growing fast.
Yeah, exponentially, it sounds like. Very interesting.
And are you gonna talk about a medical marijuana card versus what people think is a prescription for medical marijuana? Right, that difference between the recommendation and...
You have to get a prescription from a doctor before you can get a card. But if you're legally authorized to use medical marijuana, you should have a card. In Florida, I'm talking about Florida.
Does that make sense, Sandy?
Yeah.
So the expectation is you have a script, and then you go for the card.
Yes.
Does everybody?
Yes. So think that number 300,000 is huge. There are about 9,012,000 people in the non-agricultural workforce in Florida today. And if all those 300,000 people were in the workforce, that would be over 3% of the entire workforce in Florida. And it's growing fast.
Interesting. Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Mike. Any other thoughts on that from anyone else? You want to share? No? Okay. Okay, so can a drug test determine impairments, meaning current use or marijuana use? A is yes, B is no, C is other, D is not sure, and E would be depends. Let's see if technology's working. This one's kind of split right down the middle, shifting, trending. So no at 64%, we have 36%, David, that say yes. So what are your thoughts? It's kind of shrinking down, it looks like, as we go through. Quite a bit of no's.
Yeah,
Why are you
so
saying no?
those of you who answered no, you're correct, right? So there's three traditional types of drug testing used in workplace. That's an oral saliva product, a mouth swab type test, a urine test, which has been around a long time, and now hair testing is kind of becoming more popular. And in all cases, they have a different detection window. But none of them, currently, there's no technology on the market. You might have heard about, people developing a breathalyzer type machine that can detect marijuana use. It comes down to how we as human beings metabolize the THC. And so it's significantly different than the consumption of alcohol. And there's probably nowhere in the near future an actual device that's going to hold up to the scrutiny that's going to detect impairment. So as an employer, you're really challenged, especially if you have a post-accident or reasonable cause situation, to determine impairment. We work with law enforcement, even though workplace is not, impacted by law, right? You can have a positive drug test, but the person doesn't get arrested. But the states that have legalized marijuana use are challenged with the same impairment question because they're not doing drug testing in the field. They're using other techniques by looking in your eyes, and they're doing real impairment tests similar to what they do for field sobriety. And then many states are starting to use a drug test to show the presence of marijuana with the impairment test to determine, okay, that marijuana is causing your impairment. Now, that's going to be from a criminal perspective in driving a vehicle. But in the workplace setting, there's no agency out there right now that can do that impairment for you on the spot as well as do the drug test. So it's going to be really critical to stay abreast to how this develops, because the closest thing you can do if you have an accident is do the oral saliva drug test, which is going to detect from 1 hour to 12 hours. So it's not looking really any longer when it comes to marijuana itself. You know, it's not telling them they used it 3 days ago. It's telling them they've used it within the last 24 hours. So it gives you a little narrower window, but that's about all you can do. So there you go.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So my question is, if we send someone for a drug test because we have a suspicion,
Yep.
can we request that they test for marijuana?
Yeah, most reasonable cause situations, including the post-accident situations. In Florida, definitely, if we're speaking of Florida, there's lots of legislation that says you have the right to test. And in many states that are pro-marijuana, that have the legalization, they still have the right to test. There's some challenges up in the New England area from a litigation perspective, where some of the pre-employment tests, where the policy of a company wasn't written very well, and a donor had come in, was pre-employment situations, and there's several cases where the courts up there have overturned and ruled in favor of that employee. So, but from a reasonable cause and post-accident, you're protected currently.
And I asked that because we had that situation in our corporate office, and I know they sent the person out, and we turned that person, because apparently they had used within that window of time that you're referring to.
Yep.
So I just want to clarify, so you're saying the saliva test can show that somebody smoked pot from when to when?
1 hour to about 12 hours.
So within the last day?
Within the last day. The biggest challenge is consumers look at the drug testing products like, hey, ease of use, right? We can do this mouth swab test in the office. We don't need a bathroom. We don't have to bring out a collector to do those types of things. But the challenge is what do you want to know? Do you want to know, that's why the HHS and DOT are looking at hair drug testing for guys in safety sensitive. You have truck drivers, that meet the CDL criteria. They're looking at hair tests because it's going to tell you about 7 days to 90 days worth of usage. So that type of person in that safety sensitive function, they're looking for somebody who lives a life of, abstaining from a narcotic, right? The urine drug screen is going to tell you from about 4 hours of usage, right around in that window, till about 2 weeks up to 30 days for an everyday user of a marijuana. And then again, the oral saliva. So if you really want to get the gap to know, did they use something before they came into this interview, all the way up to 90 days, you'd have to do all three to get the window because they all cut off differently. So many of the really well-written drug-free workplace policies incorporate those various testing depending on the circumstances.
And DOT recognizes the last one?
No, they don't. So DOT is currently only the urine drug screen. They are exploring the hair test as part of the options, but that could take years.
Interesting. So it's plausible that companies are using different testing techniques based on pre-hire versus, obviously investigating an accident or something along those lines, right?
Absolutely.
That's what we do.
Do you?
Different types, yeah. So for our distribution center for post accidents, we use the saliva.
Yep.
It's, one, you can get back to work quicker, you have less downtime, and then also because of the window, the positive result, that if during the accident they were under the influence.
Right.
Interesting. Does a piece of that too, David, come as it relates to the time it takes to get the result back from the test, the different testing?
So depending on the state you're in, Florida is one that you can use an instant collection device and receive a result. And basically what you're looking at, and we actually had a customer yesterday in the state of Washington concerned about taking an action based upon that instant result, right? So you have to be really careful. Those screening devices are like pregnancy tests. You determine, hey, there may be the presence of something or there's no presence. So really in your case, right, it tells you there's nothing present, safe to go back to work. So in your oral saliva and in your urine, you can do that right in the field right now.
And if they come back presumptive positive, then
Yep.
we actually send them to the clinic for an actual urinalysis for the
Exactly.
official result.
That's right. And those lab tests can come back negative the next morning, up to 2 to 3 days or longer, depending on if there's something present.
We usually take them immediately.
Yeah.
And drive them ourselves.
Good.
Interesting. Any other thoughts on that from anyone? Welcome, Wade.
Thank you. Sorry I'm so late.
That's no problem at all. We understand. What we're doing is we've got an online poll. And so feel free to pull out your cell phone 22333 is who you send it to. And then you'll see the Mark Whitwer 965. You have to put that in the text box section and send that, and then you'll be able to respond to the questions that are being posed. So, you good with this one? Everybody good? Wonderful. All right, we'll move on to the next one. So, are Florida employers required to accommodate employees who have a prescription for medical marijuana? So we have yes as A, B is no, C is only if use is done away from work, and D is not sure. So we had some yeses and now they're all gone. Interesting. So we're mixed, obviously, with most of them saying no, Mike. Obviously, we've got some that aren't quite sure. So where are we with this?
Well, if I'm asked the question, my answer is no, but I really fall into the not sure category. Because clearly under the ADA, there's no obligation, Americans with Disabilities Act, there's no obligation to accommodate people. There have actually been a couple of lawsuits around the company where plaintiffs have said the ADA requires us to accommodate medical marijuana, and the courts have said, no, that's wrong. So under the ADA, under the federal law, marijuana is still a controlled substance, and there's no duty because under the ADA, there's no duty to accommodate unlawful drugs. The Florida statute is not as clear as I would like it to be. It says there's no, I'm reading from the Florida statute that implemented the constitutional amendment. This section does not require an employer to accommodate the medical use of marijuana in any workplace or an employee working while under the influence of marijuana. I mean, David just talked about how long you can detect marijuana in somebody's system for days, hours and days, but how long is somebody under the influence of marijuana, David?
Yeah, I mean, it could be as little as an hour or two, up to several hours, depending on the type of product they're using.
So if you read the Florida statute literally, you're only protected from accommodating people who use medical marijuana if they use it at work, or if you catch them, test them, whether they're actually under the influence, but can you determine whether they're under the influence?
Nope, not definitively.
So that's a big, in my mind, that's a big hole. I think the legislature did a sloppy job of just enacting the statute. And when the first lawsuits come around to point that out by some creative plaintiff's lawyer, I think the legislature's going to fix it. So I want to read you what the Georgia legislature said in their statute. They did a much better job. Employers can maintain written zero-tolerance policies prohibiting on-duty and off-duty use of marijuana, or prohibiting any employee from having a detectable amount of marijuana in such employee system at work. So if somebody tests positive in Georgia, they can be fired. I'm not positive that a court would say the same thing under the Florida statute, but I'm still telling employers there's no duty to accommodate medical marijuana until a court tells me otherwise.
And in some of the states, right up in, and I keep pointing to New England because there is case law to support it. The state courts didn't rule, regardless of the prescription of marijuana, which is really, there's no prescription for marijuana because it's not a prescribable drug, but they overlooked that part of the case, right? They went right to the ADA level and said, in order to get the marijuana card, even in the state of Florida, you're basically swearing that I'm disabled in some fashion, that I need this. So that by nature of having a card, you're disabled. And so they ruled in those favors of those employees and for the accommodation. Again, and there was a lot of language that said, look, we're pending further review. This isn't, obviously there's some appeals in those states, but we don't know if that's going to come to Florida. Right now we're protected. So you can.
A quick question: with the Florida law being so clear, if you have a drug-free workplace policy and you do pre-employment drug screening, and they test positive and they have a medical marijuana card, can we still not hire that individual? I get differing opinions.
When somebody asks me that question, my advice is you're not required to hire that person under Florida law until a court tells me otherwise.
Agree.
What do the results of somebody in that situation look like? So I have a prescription, I take a test, the medical review officer calls me and says, do you have a prescription for marijuana? I present my card. Is then the result of marijuana on the drug report listed as positive or negative?
It would be positive, because the MROs are acting under federal law, almost in 100% of cases. What some employers have done, some national employers as well as regional employers, they're taking marijuana off their pre-employment tests entirely, right? Like in the city of New York, next year, I think in May, you won't be allowed to test for pre-employment marijuana. But in many cases, when they come to those reasonable cause or post-accident situations, there's zero tolerance. The insurance companies won't mitigate, if you want defense, you have to test for marijuana in that case. So we even had a company, about 100 employees out of Arizona, who's growing, Arizona or Nevada, they're growing marijuana. And so their employees are around marijuana all the time. And their workers' comp said that, if you want coverage, you have to test for marijuana. And just by nature of being in the room with that, live plant and touching that product, they could fail the test. And so they had to come up with some really creative ways to, figure out, well, we're going to allow our employees to consume marijuana because it's legal here, we're growing it, we're pro-marijuana. But at the same time, if you have an accident and you get a positive drug test, you're not covered. So that's kind of a critical, interesting perspective.
So even if you remove marijuana, well, if you don't really look at marijuana as a company, as something you're gonna not hire somebody for, and they come back positive on marijuana, I mean, is it still, with the insurance company not gonna cover whatever accident because they did, even though the company knew the person?
So depending on your contract, we do a lot of catastrophic claims in the workers' comp insurance industry. Depending on the contract you have with them, they have the right to test as well. So in many cases, we get phone calls from the workers' comp company. We're picking up blood samples from a hospital after an incident, or we're performing a live drug test depending on the timing and the severity of the accident. They're testing for marijuana. And so they're going to deny the claim because they have that right.
It depends on what your insurance company recognizes as being positive in regards to marijuana.
That's right.
Where does the Florida Drug-Free Workplace credit come into all of this? Off of our workers' compensation, we have the safety and the drug-free workplace credit. And we have to read that language very carefully as I sign my affidavit to get my reduction on my premium. Do you know where?
So it requires you to do drug testing of applicants and employees. And under my hopeful interpretation of the Florida law, you can still do that and still legally, lawfully, and truthfully claim the credit.
Yeah, and you have to use the Florida Drug-Free Workplace Policy Panel at the laboratory in order to qualify for it, which does include marijuana. So.
Interesting. You mentioned, David, testing and the gaps, the different testing and what they can, as far as timeframes are concerned, but are there varying levels of THC levels when they do testing?
Yeah.
Does that come into play for employers saying, oh, it's a very small amount, it can be a trace amount, maybe it was secondhand versus actual consumption, those kind of things?
Yeah, we get those questions all the time. So your cutoff levels are in a urine screen different than a blood test, right? Because the active metabolites in your blood are different. So the state law in Washington, Colorado, many of the states who have legalized marijuana have just picked a random number and it's 5 nanograms in your blood. And that's what they consider you impaired. A lot of scrutiny, a lot of challenge to that level. The workplace blood test, if it's done by workers' comp carriers and we're doing a blood test, its screening is 5 nanograms, but its cutoff level is 1. So that means there could be a very small amount of THC present, and that's going to be considered positive. In a workplace perspective, for urine, it's 50 nanograms at a screen. So if you're using an instant device, it's going to kind of have a broad range and detect it. Then it's going to confirm at a laboratory at 15 nanograms in urine. So there are different levels that challenge, but again, what's impaired? I read studies in Washington first legalized marijuana. They provide medical marijuana marijuana smoked. They had guys drive, did that whole impairment test, which you've seen they did in alcohol like in the 80s, kind of determine how many joints does somebody have to smoke to be impaired, and at what level was the nanograms in their system. And most of those people had 50, 60 nanograms in their system by their third or fourth joint, and their impairment levels were varying. And again, because each person is going to have a different body type and metabolize that differently, it's really tough to say. So we're going to be a long time before we get to being able to definitively determine impairment. So it's going to come down to really the law and whether you have the right. And it's in most cases, I think you're going to see lots of litigation around safety in workplace, right? So if you're a call center and you have a ton of people in an office, probably going to have less rights to testing in that situation. But if you've got somebody operating equipment, you're more than likely we're going to see some legislation to protect those type of jobs, regardless of where federal legalization or not.
Are there any cases coming through that you said until a Florida court tells me otherwise? So what scares me about what you just said, David, is I don't want to be the versus. I don't want to be the case that people study in the state of Florida because so I get that litigation brings us answers, but I certainly don't want my company to be the one at risk or challenged to be the case that people study around the state of Florida. Are there any cases coming out that you think might give us clarity anytime soon?
I have not heard that there are any cases in the pipeline. I have talked to plaintiffs' lawyers that we know who are looking for the right case, but I don't know of any actually pending.
My prediction is you're going to see that after the ballot next year, whether it becomes legalized in the state of Florida or not.
Recreational.
Recreational. I think you're going to see more litigation after that point if it becomes legal to really fight for those pro-marijuana individuals who want to have the right to consume. So I think it's kind of in a stalemate situation.
But still, if you're a DOT employer, federal always comes.
It does, but uniquely, I'm part of the governmental affairs for NDASA, which is the National Drug and Alcohol Screening Association. We've traveled to DC over the last couple of months to try to talk about safety carve-outs, because we have things like the States Act, and now with the financial bills acts that are going through, allowing, they're trying to push through so that the marijuana industry can use, fair banking standards. And really the challenge is, repeat your question, I just lost it.
DOT.
Right, so DOT's challenge is they take their direction from HHS, right, Health and Human Services, that says in their language that we look at the Controlled Substances Act of 1980, I think it was, and that's whatever's listed there is what we can test for. So if something like the States Act is pushed through legislation all the way through the Senate as well, that kind of language says the state decides whether it's legal. So if you're in Illinois, which has recently became recreational use, that law trumps any federal law based on that legislation if it were to pass. And now marijuana would become legal within that state. It would no longer be on the Controlled Substances Act by definition of that state. And therefore, HHS, the federal government, and DOT wouldn't be allowed to test for marijuana. So that's why we're advocating that they put a safety carve out, some specific language, the same way it is for, alcohol's legal. We consume alcohol on the weekend whenever you want, not at work, same thing. So we're looking for that type of language that says you're allowed to test. And if you look at New York, I keep pointing there because they were very creative, even though they are pro-marijuana to some level, as you can kind of see, they put on their language that safety-sensitive employees, DOT, police, first responders, they listed out a very clear group of individuals that they can continue to do pre-employment testing as well as workplace testing. So it's going to come down to when there's a bill that's physically going to make it through both sides, and depending on that language, whether DOT and how we're going to get that safety carve out. So the answer, yes, DOT is protected for now, but it's at risk.
Interesting. Yeah, I think we'll move on. I have a thought that I think that Does anyone here as an employer screen specific positions versus others because of the high risk, or because they're drivers, Sandy, in your case, or versus clerical or someone that's in an IT department, or is it just a straight blanket across the board for now?
Right now, across the board.
Across the board? Everyone same boat on that?
We do management above production in our corporate employees and distribution center.
Okay. Does anyone here, as part of the drug policy or part of the pre-screen, preclude or eliminate marijuana and test for other drugs, or is it across the board on that as well? You know, one of the things I hear is that, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, is that folks that are coming off an accident or something that happen to be on an oxycodone or something that are in a position where they're driving a truck under the influence of that. Does that come up in your worlds today? Is that something that's of concern to you guys today? Thoughts about that from anyone? It's a concern, right?
Yeah.
But what do you do?
They have to report the med. I mean,
Right.
they have to report the med.
Yeah.
And then if they need it, in fact, I just had someone yesterday with a dental issue. And so coming off of Percocet, so we provided a driver, so he's functioning on the route, but he's not behind the wheel
Yeah.
as our accommodation as he needs to.
Yeah, the DOT has some specific language about those DOT drivers that if they're caught under, not caught, but if it's found that they are using an opiate like an OxyContin through a random drug screen, for instance, or they self-admit that they're using some sort of a product, that they have to seek medical guidance within 5 days, because OxyContin and opiates are now, as of January 2018, excluded. It's a medically disqualifying drug as of January 2018. So they have to get a release signed by a doctor who knows how they're using the drug, you know, and the details of what job they have, what are the safety sensitive responsibilities for them. And then that doctor has to sign over liability saying, hey, this person's safe to use that and continue to go. But in most cases, they need to seek alternative type of medication.
Right now, it's at least episodically.
Right.
Had I had someone who needs it every day,
Yep.
you know, we'd have a different discussion, but it's typically
Right.
post-op, a medical procedure.
Yeah, and they can be on leave, and yeah, absolutely.
Interesting. Okay, wonderful. Thank you for that. So we'll move on to the next question. What is the detection time of THC for employment drug testing after use? I think we talked about that a little bit, but we got A is 1 hour, B would be 2 to 5 hours, C is 5 to 7 hours, and D would be I don't know. That's a very interesting, so we're in all 4 buckets here. So, David, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so we did cover that a little bit earlier. So depending on that testing method, all of those answers are correct, the first 3, right? Oral saliva is going to detect that within 1 hour, your urine screen 2 to 5 hours, and your hair test is going to be greater than that, up to about 2 weeks. So in any case, depending on how you're testing it. So.
Okay. Put on there. Any thoughts anyone want to share on that? Pretty clear on that? Okay. So, if you have employees working in multiple states, do you have to accommodate the use of medical marijuana in states where it is legal? And I would say the answer to A is yes, B is no, C is only if it's legal both medically and recreationally, and D, I have no idea.
What if we don't have employees working in multiple states?
Interesting question.
Out of the question. Can we say?
Well, I think it could still be answered. Absolutely. Because, I mean, to David's point, you know, come next year, if it becomes medical and recreational, then obviously it's applicable, right? And so that's a big deal, and it's probably going to happen. I mean, we'll see. I don't have any insight to that, just so you know, but I would not be surprised. So predominantly, Mike, we're at 77% no. So where are we with this?
Well, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but The answer is if you have an employee in the states David was talking about in the Northeast, Maine, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and they test positive for marijuana, there is likely to be a state statute in those states and others that requires you to accommodate them or not discriminate against them because they tested positive for medical marijuana. And I've got a list of states, there are probably others, but Maine, New Jersey, New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Illinois, Nevada, I think I listed them all that I have, all protect employees in one form or another and either require non-discrimination or reasonable accommodation under the state law for employees who test positive for medical marijuana.
Can you read the states again?
The states I have, and there's probably others, are Maine, New Jersey, New York, Nevada as of January 1 of next year, Delaware, I missed that before, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, and Illinois. You know of others?
Nope, it sounds pretty complete.
We have a lot of remote employees. Is it based on where they live or where the office is?
Based on where they live. In employment law generally, an employee who lives in a state is going to be protected under the laws of that state.
That's a great question. There's so many.
And in some of those states that he mentioned, the employer has the burden to argue a case if it's a safety-sensitive type of position to show hardship or that the use of that could cause harm to the company. So if you can do that very easily, obviously somebody driving a tractor, you're going to be able to fire them under that situation. But if you're a remote employee who's working as a programmer, you're going to have a hard time and it's going to get overturned.
And in Illinois, there's a new statute for recreational marijuana.
Yeah.
And that permits employers, as I understand it, to terminate an employee if the employer can prove that the employee was under the influence of marijuana at the time at work. But as we talked about earlier, that's fairly hard to do.
Yeah, it's going to be really hard to do. They'd have to be caught, walk outside, and they're holding the joint in their hand. But that actually points to another real challenge. Even though vaping is kind of under scrutiny now in the public eye, you can vape THC oil and stand in front of a police officer, you wouldn't know the difference. It doesn't give you the odor of a standard, joint type situation. And so people can consume those at work and you don't know if that's a berry flavored, non-tobacco type product or if it's actual marijuana. So it's tough to now say, I think that you're busted, so.
I just need to clarify something you said. So is it legal for an employer in the state of Florida to terminate an employee if they test positive for marijuana?
My answer is yes. I'm hopeful that a court won't disagree with me.
Right, yeah. I mean, so, okay, because what you were just said, something about you have to prove that they're under the influence.
That's in Illinois.
Oh,
That's under the Illinois statute.
Yeah.
The person that we terminated a couple weeks ago had used it within like a week. Eventually she tested positive.
Most employers are terminating today. I mean, the city, the county in Orange County, Orlando, there's zero tolerance. Most companies are still really protected here based on our Florida statutes. So, again, that doesn't mean that a large law firm won't take the case and want to come after you, but as of right now, you're safe.
The Florida.
Was a probable cause or was it random?
No, there was reasonable suspicion based on what was happening in the workplace.
I mean, the Florida legislature has been hostile to medical marijuana since the constitutional amendment was enacted, was adopted. And so I think if somebody does successfully challenge the law, the legislature will step up and fix it pretty quickly. That's my gut feeling.
Interesting. Cheryl and I talked about CBD, right, and that incident and things, and I drive on the radio, I hear all kinds of advertisements about it, there's no THC in it, but it sounds like some instances there is, which led to a situation with use. I don't know if you want to share that or not, but I thought it was interesting.
So I work for the Tampa Y, so we do feel that, there's a lot of our positions are, at high risk for life, our lifeguards, our after-school counselors. So we do follow directly workplace, we still terminate for actually quite a few. It is a high population that we have that are using marijuana. So specifically our after-school counselors and our lifeguards seem to be the biggest population. So we will err on the side all day long for the safety of our members and the lives that are in the pool every day. So we're okay with being a test case because we will argue the fact that life is more important. But with our workers' comp, we had a water aerobics instructor that was injured, tested positive for CBD oil. She tested positive for marijuana, but when it came down to it, she was taking CBD oil. She was an older lady, and I talked to the MRO doctor for a long time, and she was devastated, not because she was devastated the fact that she thought about having marijuana in her system because that's not how she had been educated. So she was devastated at the fact that she had actually taken marijuana when everything is telling them it's not in there. And the MRO doctor said, kind of what you were talking about, everybody's body reacts to it differently. And it isn't a given that you'll test negative. And so we did follow through just to stay consistent in terminating her employment, but we also told her that in 6 months she could reapply, and then the decision was hers. So she stopped taking it, she reapplied, we rehired her, but it was a little dicey, but our attorney, our employment counsel stated more that we have to continue to be consistent with what our policy is, and we have a no tolerance for any type of drug use.
In the CBD product right now on the market, there's zero regulation, so it comes down to the science of it. Even though they're using hemp and they're extracting that, what they're finding is the concentrated oil that they use to actually make the product itself contains more THC than is allowed by law. And so what you find is you can continually refine that, but that's hundreds of thousands of dollars to refine that down to something that's safe and give you a fairly pure CBD oil product. So a good gauge is the more expensive it is potentially if it's sold by a reputable company and they have science behind what's in the product, you have a better chance of having a negative if you're using it. But you'll find if it's a low-cost product kind of sold in a gas station or maybe just a convenience store, that's going to be something they just took that raw product, they cut it with anything that they could to dilute it to where it's legal so they don't have any issues. But there's no consistency. They're just, there's no science behind it. So you have to be real careful. We've seen products from all over the country, and individuals go into a bar, it's legal, they put CBD in the drink, you go home tomorrow, we failed the drug test, literally tomorrow, just testing that out, and it's supposed to have had no THC presence, so it's really, really challenging as an employee to make those choices.
Did you have something, Wade, you want to share?
Yeah, we ran into that issue. So we had a driver of ours that was tested positive after an accident. Wasn't, just back in the mailbox or something, but still we did the testing, tested positive. Said, well, I went to the gas station and found some CBD pills, but they're legal, right? Well, yeah, they're perfectly legal, but these happen to have higher pills than we've seen. So we did, we're in healthcare, so our physicians have been doing some research about this and come up with the same thing. There's just no way to know whether the CBD oil has THC. So ideally, they're two different substances, but depending upon the quality and depending upon the manufacturing process, it could contain sufficient THC to trigger a drug test, a positive result in a drug test, or it may not. And there's just no regulation around that, and there's no way to know.
Yeah.
Did you terminate that individual?
We did. Yeah. So our stance is a little like the Wise. Being in healthcare, we have a lot of people on the road taking care of our patients, out of the patient's homes. We're in hospice care primarily. And our take on this right now is that that's a dangerous situation, and we want to make certain that our people are not impaired. There is, though, a lot of conversation in our organization about the flip side, because there are some very wonderful stories about people that are getting pain relief from CBD oil. And as a hospice, we're all about pain relief, so making certain that people are comfortable. And so there is a significant pressure inside of our organization to say, well, if somebody's taking CBD oil and it's relieving their joint pain or something that's making them feel much better just from a physical ailment, why wouldn't we do that? So we are having a lot of conversations internally, and we have a lot of variation of feeling about that. At this point in time, we're holding to our original policy, which says that no, if you test positive, then you're still terminated. But I don't know. We're going to see.
So is it legal to have different classes of employees? So for example, I have most of my employees are not DOT, but I do have some DOT employees. Can I treat them differently? Can I say the DOT employees, you're fired? And those that aren't DOT employees will do randoms, and if you have another positive, then you're fired, or something like that. Is that possible?
You could do that because you're not making a distinction based on any prohibited factor under a state or federal law like race or sex or age. So you could make that distinction. You could, I think the safer thing to do is do what both of you did and terminate somebody who tests positive because they're taking, using CBD. But you could, I think, legally make a distinction that you believe this person who told you they never used marijuana, but they only used CBD and they happen to test positive. The safer thing is to do what you did, but I think you could legally make that distinction. As more and more people use CBD, I think you're going to see this challenge coming up that Wade was talking about more often. You're going to have, your best salesperson, your best IT person who tests positive because they only use CBD and you believe them. And that's going to be a really hard decision to make.
So I have a VP that just told me yesterday that it's really helping his back, and his wife sells it.
I think it's a good idea for everyone to educate their employees about CBD and to at least tell them to go buy it in a good reputable place.
But where does HIPAA come into this? The whole privacy thing.
Well, HIPAA prohibits you as a plan sponsor of a health plan from distributing medical information about your plan participants. But you can certainly, employees can volunteer information to you. They can tell you about their medical problems. You can generally tell them about CBD without violating HIPAA. You're not talking about any individual's personal medical history.
Yeah, it's required under the DOT.
So just a couple of long-term issues. I mean, to your point, we have somebody that's called an accessibility specialist on our staff, right? And that person can talk to employees about things that I, as an HR business partner or a leader, would not do, right? So that's one option, I would think. But the other thing that comes to mind as I listen to everyone, obviously we have to have our position on this, but what about education for employees? Because I think what you said about picking something up at a convenience store, most people aren't going to know that.
Right.
And to the point of somebody with joint pain, and they really do need relief, or yours way, some of these things as human beings, right, we do have some understanding of and some tolerance for. I think our employees don't have that, right? And so I just wonder, and it's a rhetorical question, but that's something I think we should.
It's a requirement of DOT that you educate your employees on not only your policy, but drug impairment and those types of things. So, legally, DOT is always treated as a separate than a non-DOT test and environment. And some employers that we have right now, their policies are written and they exclude everybody in the office. Obviously, if you're in Massachusetts, you're required. There's only 358 defined jobs in the state statute that says you can test these type of people from a random drug testing perspective, and everyone else you can't. So lots of employers are already separating their workforces from safety to office, and then treating them differently. But to clarify what you were asking, no one, to my knowledge, is allowing someone to fail a drug test and say, hey, the second time you fail a drug test is when you're going to get fired. You have to have a very clear policy or you will get sued and you probably will lose that says you can seek substance abuse help, but we're still zero tolerance. You're going to get into a very gray area if you allow someone to fail a drug test and continue employment, because you're going to have to treat everybody in that pool the same way except for DOT.
How does alcohol fall into this? Is it the same? So if somebody flunks an alcohol test, so there's no sending them to rehab and giving another chance and then doing the randoms and.
Yeah, it's up to your policy, right? So in workplace environment, alcohol is zero tolerance in most cases. So if I come in and administer a breath alcohol test on an employee that we think is impaired, and he tests positive for greater than 0.04, even though the state limit for driving is 0.08, 0.04 is traditionally people follow the DOT standard, you're going to terminate them. But the idea, many companies are now creating a second chance policy. You've got that vice president, executive guy who's, or super IT guy who's your best employee. Most companies are currently quickly writing provisions to allow them to just seek some help, which is required. That's the language it's used. Really, they're just seek the counsel of a substance abuse professional. They write some sort of a testing policy for them to return to work, and then they can come back to work after a couple of weeks, but they have to now abstain, right? So.
That's kind of where I was going, because we've done that for
Yeah.
alcohol. We've actually done that.
Got it.
We had somebody who was in a critical job, tested,
Yep.
sent them out, they took an FMLA, got dried out, and now they're a great employee, and we do randoms every once in a while, but I don't know how you do that with marijuana.
It's the same thing. I mean,
I had a case that, we had an employee that actually came to us. It wasn't something that was discovered in a test.
sure,
She came to
self-admitted.
us, said she had a problem, that she was seeking treatment. So we, allowed her to take the time to go seek the treatment, but it was with the understanding that if she came back, she was gonna undergo, 8 unannounced screenings over a 12-month period.
Yep.
And as long as she continued to stay clean, then we didn't have any problem. So that's what we, ended up doing, and it was something that my vendor set up for us, and I wasn't doing the picking. I just got an email from them, and it said, okay, it's time for her to go. And then we just emailed her manager and said, okay, as soon as she comes into work, give her her paperwork, and she goes down to the clinic now. And it's worked out. It was great. She was able to stay clean, and
I just don't know how you do that with marijuana, because you can't tell if they use, you know what I mean? So if you have the issue, and they
Yep.
test positive, and so you say, okay, you need to take a leave and get whatever night out,
Sure.
term would be. And then, but it still shows up on tests.
well, that's
you know,
but
a month
we
later.
have ours for a certain time frame though.
Right.
If she's getting clean in treatment, she should be clean on all her other tests, no matter.
Not in marijuana,
Well,
it
if you,
still show up.
what you're going to find is most of those substance abuse professional processes are multiple weeks long, right? They're going to be leaving work for a couple of weeks at minimum, up to a month, and then most of the testing they're going to do at a clinic, or whether we come out to do it at your site, is going to be a urine test. And so that's only really looking at about a 2-week consumption. And so the requirement to return to duty will be that they pass a test. So you'll have a line of demarcation that they passed the test at this point, they now are doing their job, and then as the random test comes along, they're going to continually test clean. So you're going to have a point in which there's no detection in their system in order for them to return to work.
Okay.
I've
So,
seen,
we need to just get the word out that CBD oil, people, if you test positive and it's just because of CBD oil, it still applies. The drug-free workplace policy still applies to you now.
I've seen a few more employers giving people a second chance with marijuana or some other drugs, like with alcohol. Some along the line of what you did, where somebody self-reports. A few where somebody actually is caught in a drug test, although that's more rare. But there is some expansion in my experience of companies that are willing to give people a second chance. Sorry?
Maybe self-referral, but they end up on the most extended step of discipline, and then and they go through random testing, just as part of the normal, and then if they're tested positive again, we terminate.
That's exactly what we did.
Can we go back to the science?
Okay.
So we have 3 employees who've been brought to the testing. Random, reasonable suspicion, post-accident, what doesn't matter. So we have somebody who's using CBD oil on her knee. We have someone who took CBD brownie from Wawa's. And we have a driver who smoked a joint. The science is all 3, this is a question, is the science that all 3 people will trip the THC trigger at the MRO's office and be reported to the employer as positive? Is that correct?
There's no way to currently detect the difference between hemp THC and regular marijuana
Right,
THC.
the
So
science is all three of those are
all three of
positive.
those will be a positive if they're greater than the level in their system.
So it doesn't
It
matter
It
then.
depends on the CBD oil that they took. Some CBD oil does not have sufficient THC.
Oh, no, agreed, but in
Yeah.
this particular case, whatever he chose,
Yeah.
the science is, as an employer, I do not have to enter into a discussion about your medical problem and your choice to pick up something at the thing. You got it from the head shop in Hudson, or you got it from the
None of that matters.
non-federally regulated, hey, this is what we certify on our nut bar.
Right.
It's going to be reported as positive.
Right.
And then therefore, we can terminate for policy.
Yes.
I mean, as gray as this is, I'm trying to find something that is definitive. And clearly, right now, in the state of Florida, until the court tells us otherwise, we can terminate.
Yes.
And Phyllis's point is, we're in the human resource function. So the people side is what, for me, is the most relevant, which is, somebody didn't want to get high, they wanted to get well.
Which is why we had engaged in, and she wasn't upset with us, fortunately, in this case. You know, but that's why we offered to allow her to reapply, when we have always kind of given a 6-month. I mean, it's to anybody who, you know, doesn't disclose something on their background check that wouldn't have been disqualifying, but they falsified the application. Reapplying 6 months, you know, it's on your application. It's kind of the same thing. We wanted, but at the same time, she also had to determine, as of right now today, in the state of Florida, and our policy being a drug-free workplace, you can come back, but you're still not gonna be able to take it. So she wanted to come back, and so she's been okay. But yeah, but now we also are educating. So I do a supervisor training. We talk about it. You guys need to understand that this is part of it. And so kind of educating, and it is always an aha moment for them.
And is part of your education then, consumer beware? The risk is just as significant as taking a hit on a joint.
Yep.
Are you gonna get called for a random drug screen in the next 21 days?
We talk
Right?
about it in our risk training, we talk
Okay.
about it in supervisor training. We're trying to get the word out so that people are more educated.
And Sandy, here's the reason why I think you should do what you're talking about, and that is treat them all the same. Because Floyd, we know that 95, 99% of your employees are great people, but there's always a few that know the law and their rights. And there's somebody that's gonna test positive and tell you, who's been smoking joints, you know, before work for breakfast, but is gonna tell you, all I did was take a CBD pill. I never touched a marijuana cigarette. And then how are you gonna tell whether that person's telling you the truth? And we all know that one person in your organization who.
And then we also kind of go back to what you were talking about, is we will consistently terminate every time for a post-accident or suspicion or pre-employment. But if someone does come to us on their own free will and say, I'm really struggling with this, we will not terminate them. And we tell them that when we hire them. You are upfront with us, we will get you help. But if you don't, you can't use oh crap, I got caught.
Yeah.
And then decide you want to get help. So, yeah.
Interesting conversation. That's a tough one. All right, let's move on to the next question. See where we are with this. You as an employer have the right to a safe and drug-free workplace. Yes, no, I don't know, other, or depends. I figured this would be 100% across the board.
Yeah.
So I would say, in essence, David, is that where we are with this, or?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially in the state of Florida, 100% zero tolerance is protected under the law.
And is that tied into the corporation's, organization's workforce policy as it relates to alcohol and drugs? Is that right? Or is it a correlation there?
Yeah, I mean, you need to have a well-defined policy that states your stance as an employer is zero tolerance, and then educate your employees that you're zero tolerance. If you don't do that, you'll find you may lose your right in a particular case.
There are some exceptions to that. So there's some nursing regulations in the state of Florida that deal with impaired nurses, so there's an IPM program, impaired nurse program basically, that say that if you do have a positive test on a nurse, that you have to follow their protocol before you follow your own. It's not real common, I don't think, in other fields, but it's an interesting add-on for the nursing field.
I think the protocol is just naming them through IPM instead of DOH, but you can still count them.
Yeah, we haven't found the ability to terminate right away.
No.
Yeah, we found that our legal advice has been you need to put them through the IPM program, and if they successfully go through that program and are judged okay, then we have to take them back, so.
I suspect every one of you have a drug-free workplace policy of one sort or another. But in this day and age, I think it's, and I haven't really thought about this until right now, but I think it's not a bad idea to send out information to your employees that you are a drug-free workplace, you're gonna test for marijuana, you're gonna fire people who test positive for marijuana, including medical marijuana, and encouraging people not to use medical marijuana if they can avoid it, and certainly not to use CBD, because it may cause them to lose their jobs. And if they decide to use it for their own medical reasons, then that's a choice they can make. But I think it's not a bad idea to tell people up front what the employment ramifications may be if they make that choice.
We, as our industry group in Florida with other wholesalers, there are 16 other wholesalers in Florida I network with extensively. As an industry, we decided to restate our policy. You know, maybe I haven't signed my drug-free workplace policy in X number of years. So we just decided to restate, send it out. It's 2019, here's what we know. We don't want anyone to get caught off guard, misinformed. Somebody in your neighborhood said the distributor who wants, it just, here's the employer's educational component. And we've restated our drug-free workplace policy to every single employee.
I think that's a good idea.
That's a great idea. Absolutely. Maybe a big piece of your onboarding as well when you bring new employees on.
Well, we've always done that.
Yeah.
But it's the 10-year person or the 20-year person
Yeah.
that maybe hasn't looked at it and forgot it, and we've updated it through the years, yes, but maybe we haven't. We just sent it to all 400 employees and said, I need you to sign the top sheet and return it to me.
When you do random drug testing, as an employee, I guarantee that once a year, I'm gonna be in that drug random room. So I could go 10 years.
Or you could go once every 12 months. Once a month for 12 months. I mean, random is random. You're in the pool. My testing site draws 20 names. You're always eligible to be drawn.
But it's true random. It's
kind of like the lottery. I buy a
sitting
ticket
out
every
before,
year.
like you get told.
Stop.
I know,
Yeah.
but this is where I struggle, because, so Joe, who didn't get the lottery for 10 years, is there high every day, and Mary got caught.
Yeah, but if they're high every day, you're gonna see their
You're
behavior,
gonna
and you're gonna keep testing basically. So a random test is not the only thing you do. You also do if there's reasonable suspicion, you also do if there's, like for us, any accident. Any accident, I don't care if you just back in the mailbox and tell a little bit of paint, you're going for a drug test. And we actually don't do random tests on ours. We do it for reasonable suspicion. So a supervisor says that I'm slurring my words and, not
And also your random pool can be that you test 100% of your employees within a calendar year.
Okay, because that makes sense too, yeah.
Yeah. So everybody would know
You don't
they're
know
getting
when.
tested this year, they just don't know when.
Yeah.
So some employers are doing that.
Okay. So we covered that. So let's move on to, and I did change the verbiage of this a little bit because I wanted to add a legal component to it, because I think anyone can test them. The question is it legal to do so, right? So the question is, can you legally conduct a drug test on an employee after an accident if they are unconscious or deceased? So A is yes, B is no, C is depends, D is other, and E would be no or not sure. So almost 80% are not sure or no. Bouncing around a little bit here and there, but I think it kind of spells out kind of where people are with this data.
Yeah, so there's a little bit of a technicality. If they've signed your drug-free workplace policy and it says we're allowed to test you after an accident, they've already given you consent. So like those workers' comp insurance adjusters, you had blood taken at the hospital as soon as you walked through. You've lost an arm, okay, and you're probably unconscious because you've lost your arm. That blood that was collected at that time of entry into that hospital is being tested under the workplace policy to determine impairment. So technically, yes, you can test somebody who's impaired, unconscious, and as well as deceased, right? So you still have that right based on that original consent to collect those specimens and to make your determinations based upon those samples collected.
I have a question. Does anybody else handle this? I've had 2 different hospitals refuse to drug test someone who went into the ER.
So there is zero regulation amongst hospital networks. There's no standardization as to whether someone will or won't test at those hospitals. So that's why companies like us get those phone calls from employers or those mitigators for the insurance companies, and we're asked to go to that hospital and collect a specimen, collect urine out of a catheter bag, whatever it takes to get as close to the accident as possible. If it's still within 8 hours, to do a breath alcohol test if that person is conscious, to determine if alcohol's there. Because, you know, the reason we're picking blood up, we're putting preservation letters into that hospital to preserve all samples, is so that we have a way to get as close to that accident to determine if there's a presence there. So we find from that process of picking up, literally we pick up in all hospitals across the country, there is zero standardization. You know, some you have to go through 100 hoops and subpoenas, and even with subpoenas, you're challenged to pick up the specimens because the lab manager works at 2 a.m. and they're never there more than an hour a day, and you've got to pick it up from that person, right? And so sometimes you have to just go through those hurdles. But 100% of the time we are able to get the specimens if they have them.
Everybody good on that one? Okay, perfect. See what else we got going here. Okay, so do you have to provide intermittent leave under the Family and Medical Leave Act for employees that use medical marijuana for illness treatment? And I did tweak that question as well, Mike. I hope that was okay. I thought it was important to not so much the use of medical marijuana, but that it's being used specifically to treat a specific illness, maybe one of the ones that you mentioned are protected in certain areas. Pretty definitive so far. So I think pretty definitive, Mike.
There's a few people who think that's a trick question.
Yeah, not sure.
But the answer is no. You don't have to provide for people just to use medical marijuana. If somebody comes to you and says, I need some time off to use medical marijuana because I don't want to fail a drug test, you don't have to agree to that, but you do have to look, of course, at the underlying medical condition to see if it constitutes a serious medical condition under the Family Medical Leave Act. The real, I guess we'll get to the next question, which is the real harder question when they come back.
Yeah, well, I can pop that up right now. So kind of leads into this here. So if your employee has a medical marijuana card, do you as an employer have to make accommodations if they operate heavy equipment? Is that the one or the next one down? We can come back, we'll get an answer to that one. There you go. Can you as an employer conduct a fitness for duty exam upon an employee's return from FMLA leave in order to determine whether marijuana was used? The answers are yes, A, no, only for specific roles, only if use is apparent, and D would be other. Or E would be other, excuse me. Pretty resounding.
Yeah. So I think that in Florida, that's the right answer. You're going to do, under the FMLA, you do fitness for duty exams for everyone who comes back. Part of that can be a drug test, and if they test positive for marijuana, you could terminate people or not let them come back. In other states, that may not be the right answer, where it's states that protect the use of marijuana. But the question is, are you gonna do a drug test on people as part of the fitness for duty exam, or require a drug test as part of the fitness for duty exam? Some employers have a standard policy of doing a drug test whenever an employee's out on leave for some period of time. If they test positive in that return to work, right now, the law in Florida is you can terminate that person if they test positive for marijuana.
Interesting. So we got about 10 minutes left, just under. Is there anything else that's on anyone's mind? I mean, I'm sure we can, if you have other questions and things maybe we didn't cover, I know we touched on a lot of things today. You know, certainly let me know. We can certainly reach out to these gentlemen, and I'm sure that they'd be happy to ask. So, yeah, please, Mike.
So we've talked a lot about how it's okay to keep firm on a drug policy. I'd like to just talk a little bit about the other side. What if we, due to, you know, Sandy says, due to the human condition, want to really allow our employees to find some relief to pain conditions or issues like that? Is there any way that we can do that well? Is there any way that we can come up with a policy or practice that says, I mean, I like some of the ideas, maybe second chance is an option, or even utilizing FMLA, but, you know, like, so we've got a lot of nurses and nursing aides. It's a rough job. I mean, their bodies are just getting beat up over 20, 30, 40 years. And, you know, at the end of their career, they've got a lot of skeletal issues, musculoskeletal issues, and, you know, I can understand where they would be in pain, and something like this might alleviate that pain. Do you have any recommendations about how we could allow them to find this relief and still have a reasonable policy?
Tackle that.
You know, the answer is no. I mean, there's just not. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I agree, but I also think that if the number of people with medical marijuana cards in Florida keeps growing exponentially, a large percentage of every one of our workforces is going to be a medical marijuana user, and you may not be able to hire enough people.
You'll run out of people
who are not medical marijuana users somewhere down the road, and that's going to be exacerbated if recreational marijuana is legalized.
So talk to us about your advice to us, Mike, about one of the things we also talked about at our industry conference was the way to tackle that is to remove marijuana testing from our policy, and then therefore CBD and anything caught up in that net of THC would then not be tested for, therefore not detected. What is your reaction to that?
Well, that scares me, because as a lawyer, I'm looking at the potential liability of somebody at work under the influence of marijuana, driving a truck, driving a forklift. Non-DOT, driving a forklift in a warehouse.
Yep.
Dropping a heavy piece of equipment.
About the accountant doing payroll. I mean, I think a lot of things are.
Yeah, but I'm, you know, that's a performance issue. That's an effectiveness issue. But as a lawyer, I'm always looking at liability. So if somebody in your employee is using marijuana at work, or is under the influence of marijuana at work and hurts somebody outside the company, you're going to have some potential liability.
Well, and then to add to that, right, the accountant. How many times does the accountant pick up lunch for people? They get in their car while on the clock, and they're now driving when you didn't hire them to drive, but now they're in that in a safety role, and then they have that accident. I have a florist friend who has that situation happen.
No, I wish we could treat it like alcohol, because alcohol is legal. People drink alcohol, have a glass of wine every night. But we don't want them to have that glass of wine or vodka in a water bottle or whatever at work. We don't want them to be under the influence at work. So for me, that's where I'm really struggling, because I want my employees, I want that VP to be able to get pain relief and not have to worry, because I know he's not high at work. It would be obvious if he was high at work. And so I wish there was a way that we could treat it the same way we do alcohol, so that then the saliva test is used. Okay, well, if you test positive for it, then maybe you used it too soon. I don't know.
I mean, there's people racing to try to figure out a technology to determine, if it's used now, and because of how long it takes to have enough cases to determine a pattern like we have done over the years with alcohol. It's so far into the future. They're passing the legalization faster than the technology or the science can come back and back that up. So, unfortunately, as an employer, you carry the weight. You have to take that risk and either say, hey, we're going to allow it here and we're going to figure out how to mitigate those, situations that happen, or we're not.
Can you allow it and keep the drug-free workplace?
Not a Florida drug-free workplace policy, no.
One thing you could do is do what you do with the IPN program. People are, Wade's familiar with, people who employ nurses are familiar with it. You could have a company-wide IPN program. To answer Wade's question, one thing you could do to try to mitigate some of the risk. You couldn't have a drug-free workplace policy. You wouldn't get the 5% discount. You wouldn't, people would not be disqualified if they had an accident, disqualified from workers' comp benefits. But if you wanted to let people use marijuana and not get fired for off-duty use, you could do something like have a company-wide IPN program.
But at the end of that program isn't the point that they would no longer be on it in order to come back to work. So you're still running in, it's kind of running in a circle.
In theory, yes.
In theory, right? So, no good answer.
Interesting.
We had talked a little bit in our organization about trying to get around it by having an impairment test. So to say, okay, if we are sensing impairment, that's when we're going to pull the trigger. But if we're not seeing impairment, the challenge we ran into is our workforce is so remote, and having a manager go out and test for impairment is almost a practical impossibility. So
That's one discussion I've heard at our industry conference, on side conversations, is that companies like us who have field agents who go out to workplaces, who are, on call 24 hours a day, who can show up, and we do that for, Fortune 100 companies all over the country. We show up on site 24 hours a day when they have a reasonable cause or they have an accident, is that workforce, ours, gets trained in the same detection of impairment that law enforcement uses, and then you would use a twofold type of a detection. You think there's a reasonable cause or there's some incident, you're going to run an impairment test, obviously if they're not catastrophically hurt, and then back that up with a drug test. And those two indicators would be kind of how you would mitigate it if you were allowing it, right? So that if you didn't have the determination of impairment, there's nothing showing the current signs of use, but they had the positive, you could then, in theory, based on custom written policy, determine that that's going to be okay. It would require the twofold. It's huge, yeah. I mean, it's a huge challenge, but that's right now the only thing we see as an option. It's the only thing is an option. So, especially with a workforce like yours, there's nobody out in the field watching the nurse. She's doing the job or he's doing the job out at the patient's sites. They're very, very rarely coming in contact. All you would have is the possible slurring of speech on a phone conversation to use to determine that impairment and in order to enact some sort of a situation like that. So
Even if you did that, though, you'd still lose your drug-free workplace.
you would, yeah, you wouldn't get your discounts in the state of Florida.
Are we gonna have recreational marijuana in Florida? So all this is gonna be moved next year anyway?
Should have the questions.
It should have been.
Should have been.
It should have been. I mean,
There's one lawyer out there fighting real hard to get it passed.
he's ready.
So
Guys, I really appreciate it. I hope this was helpful, at least some good information here. I want to thank Mike and David very much. So guys, thank you very much. This was, the intent of this always is this kind of interaction, so we're super excited you guys are able to come. And again, any questions that we didn't get to, they may or may not be relevant to your businesses, but I'll make sure that they get answered. And then again, if you go to the HRPS site under the library, you'll see the PowerPoint there, and I'll make sure that those questions are there. I'll help you with the technology as well. Again, it's a free service, so it's a neat way to keep people very engaged. There's a lot of different options in there that are free. So if you go in there, again, it's open everywhere. They're not paying me to say this. I just think it's a neat little tool. And so I'm glad you guys enjoyed it. Thanks for playing along. Have a wonderful day, guys. Thank you very much.